For decades, a tomb in the ancient world carried the name of Cleopatra's sister. Museums labeled it, books repeated it, and documentaries reinforced the identification. Later biological analysis suggested that the individual buried inside was male. The monument stands in what was once one of the most powerful cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. In Ephesus, along the routes that once led toward the Temple of Artemis, an unusual structure rises from the late Hellenistic landscape. An 8-sided tomb constructed from carefully cut limestone blocks, elevated above its surroundings and positioned in a prominent urban setting. Its geometry is deliberate, its masonry refined, and its visibility unmistakable. Whoever was placed within it was not intended to vanish anonymously into the ground. The tomb is dated stylistically and archaeologically to the final decades of the 1st century BCE, a period when Rome's internal conflicts extended deeply into its eastern territories. Ephesus, wealthy and strategically placed along the coast of Asia Minor, became a stage upon which political decisions carried consequences far beyond the city itself. In 41 BCE, a royal woman was executed there on the orders of Mark Antony. She had previously sought sanctuary within the Temple of Artemis. Her name was Arsinoe IV. Arsinoe was the half-sister of Cleopatra VII. During the power struggles that followed Julius Caesar's assassination, she had become both a political symbol and a liability. Antony's decision to eliminate her was part of a broader contest over legitimacy in the Roman world. The execution was public and deliberate, designed to resolve a lingering dynastic threat. Within the same city stood a monumental octagonal tomb from precisely this era. Its architectural form echoed Hellenistic royal traditions, and its scale implied status rather than obscurity. The chronology aligned. A royal woman had died in Ephesus, and a royal-looking tomb stood in Ephesus. Over time, these parallel facts began to converge in interpretation. There was no inscription naming Arsinoe. No funerary record described her burial. No ancient text linked her directly to this structure. The identification rested on historical alignment, date, location, plausibility, and it was not an irrational proposal. It was coherent and contextually attractive. Through repetition in scholarship and public history, the Octagon gradually became associated, almost automatically, with Cleopatra's sister. Certainty rarely arrives as a declaration, it accumulates through acceptance. Skeletal remains recovered from the tomb were long assumed to support the prevailing identification. Only later were the bones examined with more advanced biological methods. Osteological assessment estimated the individual's age at death to be approximately 11 to 14 years. Subsequent analyses indicated male sex. Radiocarbon testing placed the burial within the appropriate historical window of the late Hellenistic period, confirming the monument's chronology but not the assumed identity. Genetic markers suggested affinity with Mediterranean populations beyond Ptolemaic Egypt, though the data remain limited and subject to interpretation. Observed skeletal irregularities have been noted in published studies, yet their significance is uncertain. What remained stable was the monument itself. What shifted was the story attached to it. The question moved quietly. It was no longer whether Arsinoe had been executed in Ephesus, that event remains anchored in 41 BCE, but how a plausible convergence of architecture and history had solidified into accepted fact without direct proof. A name adhered to stone because the narrative fit what observers expected to find. If the Octagon does not contain Arsinoe IV, then her burial place remains unknown. And the adolescent interred within that carefully constructed monument stands without a recorded name, elevated in architecture yet absent from written memory. Sometimes what we believe lies inside a monument is shaped less by evidence than by the expectations we bring to it. The tomb of Tutankhamun remained sealed in the limestone of the Valley of the Kings for more than 3,000 years. KV-62 survived looting that stripped other royal burials bare, and when it was finally opened, its painted walls, nested coffins, and ritual assemblages were found largely intact. The burial of a king who died around 1323 BCE endured in a state of extraordinary preservation. Yet even in its survival, the tomb has always appeared unusual. Compared with the expansive multi-corridor plans of other 18th dynasty pharaohs, KV-62 is compact. The burial chamber is modest in proportion, its layout compressed rather than monumental. The chamber walls are coated in painted plaster, scenes of divine reception and funerary ritual applied over a carefully prepared surface. Beneath those painted surfaces, faint linear traces can be observed. Subtle, straight interruptions in the plaster align in ways that resemble architectural edges rather than decorative coincidence. The geometry of the burial chamber is slightly offset from expected royal symmetry, and the orientation of certain wall planes differs from standard patterns of the period. These details have led some scholars to propose that the tomb may have been adapted from an earlier plan, rather than conceived entirely for Tutankhamun. From these irregularities emerged a hypothesis that the north wall of the burial chamber might conceal a sealed doorway. If the tomb had originally been prepared for another royal figure and later repurposed after Tutankhamun's unexpected death at approximately 19 years of age, then a hidden extension beyond the painted plaster became conceivable. Within that possibility lay a more dramatic suggestion that the burial of Nefertiti, whose tomb has never been conclusively identified, might remain concealed behind the chamber walls. The idea did not begin with excavation. It began with interpretation of surface detail. High-resolution imagery made underlying lines more visible, and architectural comparison emphasized deviation. A potential void, once imagined, began to acquire shape in discussion long before it was demonstrated in stone. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted to test the hypothesis. Early readings were interpreted by some as indicating anomalies consistent with changes in density behind the walls. The possibility of concealed space intensified. A tomb that had stood intact since the 14th century BCE began to feel paradoxically unfinished. The structure itself, however, remained unchanged. More comprehensive radar analyses later concluded that no additional chambers could be confirmed adjacent to the burial chamber. Variations detected in earlier scans were understood to be consistent with natural geological differences and plaster composition. No sealed doorway was revealed, and no further burial chamber emerged from behind the painted walls. The tomb continues to stand as it has for millennia. The deeper question is not whether a hidden chamber exists, but why the suggestion of absence seemed so persuasive. The monument had endured for over 3,000 years without visible indication of incompleteness. It contained extraordinary wealth and an undisturbed royal burial. Yet once subtle lines were noticed beneath plaster, the notion that something more must lie beyond them felt almost inevitable. When architecture deviates from expectation, we assume it conceals an explanation. When symmetry appears interrupted, we search for continuation. In that search, the imagined space can become as compelling as any confirmed chamber. Tutankhamun's tomb remains what it has always been, a preserved royal burial from the late 18th dynasty. The walls bear their painted scenes. The chamber retains its scale. What shifted was not the monument, but the narrative projected onto it. Stone can invite us to imagine what lies beyond it, but when the evidence lies not in walls, but in broken human remains, the story changes. The hill does not look violent at first glance. Its earthworks rise in measured curves, wide banks folded around one another in deliberate succession, enclosing the chalk plateau of southern Dorset. Generations shaped those defenses long before Rome entered Britain. Ditches were cut deeper over time, ramparts reinforced, entrances redesigned. This was not a temporary refuge, but a long-inhabited settlement structured across centuries of the late Iron Age. By the 1st century BCE, the enclosure dominated the surrounding countryside, built not for spectacle, but for endurance. When excavations began in the 20th century, trenches cut into that accumulated history. Beneath layers of soil within the interior of the enclosure, archaeologists encountered burials unlike the more orderly interments known from other Iron Age sites. Several skeletons lay close together. Some appeared to have been placed without elaborate ritual. The bones themselves carried visible trauma. Sharp force injuries marked ribs and vertebrae. One individual retained a projectile point lodged in bone. Cranial fractures suggested blows delivered at close range. The evidence was not subtle. The broader historical frame was already well established. In 43 CE, Roman forces advanced into southern Britain under Claudius, consolidating imperial control over territories that had long operated independently. Hill forts such as Maiden Castle stood within that contested landscape. A fortified enclosure crowned by earthworks could easily be imagined as a defensive stronghold resisting invasion. When Sir Mortimer Wheeler directed the excavation in the 1930s, he interpreted the burials within that context. The injured individuals, he argued, were defenders killed during a Roman assault. The narrative formed with persuasive clarity. Empire had arrived, resistance had been crushed, and the dead testified to conquest. The interpretation did not emerge from invention. The invasion of Britain was documented, the hill fort was fortified, the skeletons were wounded. The convergence of these elements created a story that felt proportionate to Rome's expansion. Within both academic and popular imagination, Maiden Castle became emblematic of violent subjugation. The hill was no longer only a settlement, it was a battlefield fixed in bone. Yet the burials contained more complexity than the single event assigned to them. Advances in radiocarbon dating allowed individual skeletons to be examined independently. The resulting dates did not erase the late Iron Age occupation of the site, nor did they eliminate the presence of violence. What they altered was timing. The individuals did not die within one narrow historical window. Their deaths extended across decades, spanning the late Iron Age and the early Roman period. Instead of clustering around the invasion, the chronology stretched outward. The injuries remained. Cuts and fractures still marked the skeletons. Violence had occurred. What shifted was the assumption that all of those injuries belonged to the same coordinated assault. Some individuals likely died before Roman forces arrived in southern Britain. Others lived into the period of occupation. Rather than evidence of one catastrophic assault, the burials suggest episodes of conflict unfolding within a society already navigating tension and change. The structure of the hillfort itself complicates the image of sudden annihilation. Archaeological layers do not reveal a widespread destruction horizon consistent with overwhelming attack. Occupation patterns shifted gradually rather than collapsing abruptly. The massacre narrative drew strength from the expectation that empire leaves decisive endings, and injured bodies within defensive walls seem to confirm that expectation. Maiden Castle preserves evidence of violence without preserving certainty about its cause. The burials resist consolidation into a single dramatic episode. They remain individual lives marked by injury, placed within the earth at different moments, separated by years rather than bound to one morning of defeat. The hill does not proclaim massacre, it presents complexity. And when complexity is mistaken for collapse, continuity itself begins to disappear from view. And when continuity is overlooked, entire societies can seem to vanish simply because we expected them to. One of the earliest urban civilizations in the Americas is said to have vanished, yet the valley where it rose never emptied. In the super valley of present-day Peru, monumental platform mounds and sunken circular plazas were constructed while much of the world still measured time in smaller, dispersed communities. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Caral had emerged as a center of coordinated labor and ceremonial life. Massive earthen pyramidal structures dominated the desert plain. Public spaces were deliberately arranged. Construction required long-term organization rather than sudden mobilization. The settlement bore no defensive walls and offers no clear evidence of large-scale warfare. Its authority was architectural rather than military. For centuries, Caral operated within a delicate ecological system. Agriculture depended on river stability and careful management. Cotton cultivation supported fishing economies along the nearby Pacific coast. Exchange networks linked coastal, highland, and interior regions, distributing goods and sustaining interdependence. The system was complex and vulnerable to environmental fluctuation. Climatic instability, prolonged drought and shifting river patterns placed pressure on agriculture and settlement patterns. Over time, large-scale construction diminished. Major ceremonial expansions ceased. Population density appears to have declined. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Caral no longer functioned as a dominant urban center. From this reduction in monumentality, a conclusion followed: collapse. The supervalley itself did not empty. Settlement persisted across the region. Communities reorganized in response to changing environmental conditions. Rather than a single catastrophic end, The archaeological record suggests redistribution and adaptation. Approximately 12 kilometers from the sacred city of Caral, on an elevated geological terrace overlooking the valley, another center developed during the later phase of this tradition. Peñico flourished around 1800 to 1500 BCE. Its placement above the valley floor offered greater stability and visibility along routes connecting coast and highlands. Excavations have revealed ceremonial structures, organized plazas, and evidence of coordinated labor. The scale differs from Caral's largest monuments, yet the underlying planning principles remain recognizable. Architectural continuity suggests inherited knowledge, rather than abrupt cultural replacement. Artifacts recovered from the site indicate participation in long-distance exchange networks that had characterized the region for centuries. When monumental construction slows and central authority appears less visible, the narrative of civilizational failure becomes tempting. Yet Peñico demonstrates that social organization did not dissolve. It adjusted, power reconfigured. Settlement patterns responded to environmental realities rather than abandoning them. What diminished was a specific architectural expression of authority. What endured was the capacity to reorganize. Caral's pyramids ceased expanding, but the valley retained the memory of how to build, how to trade, and how to coordinate labor across distance. The absence of new monumental cores does not necessarily mark extinction. It may reflect a change in scale, a recalibration of structure under ecological constraint. History often preserves its loudest phases in stone. Quieter transitions leave fewer signatures, and those absences are easily mistaken for endings. Silence in the archaeological record can signify disappearance, or it can signal that continuity has taken a different form. Someone placed a body carefully into a shallow pit. The knees were drawn toward the chest. The posture was not the result of accident. The surrounding sediment had been disturbed by human hands rather than collapse or erosion. Nothing in the cave required this configuration. It was imposed. Tinshemet Cave lies within the limestone hills of what is now central Israel, part of a region long known for preserving some of the earliest burials in human history. The layer in which these remains were found dates to roughly 100,000 years ago, during the Middle Paleolithic. In that era, stone tools are expected, hearths are expected, cut-marked animal bones are expected. Structured responses to death are not. At least 5 individuals were recovered from the burial context. Their bodies were placed in flexed positions, knees bent toward the torso. The pits appear to have been excavated intentionally. The skeletons were not scattered or disarticulated in patterns typical of carnivore disturbance. Their orientation suggests decision rather than disposal. Ochre fragments were present within the burial layer. The pigment does not occur naturally in that concentration in the cave's sediment, indicating it was brought in. Basalt pebbles, geologically foreign to the surrounding limestone, were found near some of the bodies. Animal remains appeared in proximity, though not in patterns consistent with ordinary refuse. These elements do not confirm ceremony, they do demonstrate selection. The Levant during this period functioned as a corridor of interaction between populations of early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Comparable burials at nearby sites such as Skul and Kafze have long been discussed as possible evidence of early symbolic behavior. Tinshemet enters that discussion not through spectacle but through continuity. The pattern recurs. Excavated pits, flexed bodies, transported pigment, objects placed where geology would not have placed them. For much of the 20th century, complex ritual behavior was treated as a relatively late development, associated with fully modern humans tens of thousands of years later. Burial became a threshold marker of advanced cognition. The presence of intentional interment at 100,000 years ago complicates that boundary. The issue is not whether these individuals were buried. The stratigraphy and spatial relationships support that conclusion. The difficulty lies in determining what burial signified at that depth in time. Was this protection from scavengers, a hygienic practice, a social marker of belonging, or did the act carry symbolic weight beyond practical necessity? The burial remains intact. The belief that shaped it does not. A flexed body can be read as fetal symbolism. Ochre can be interpreted as a representation of blood or renewal. Stones can be framed as offerings. Each interpretation rests on analogy rather than inscription. No carved sign accompanies the bones. No written belief survives. What remains is structured behavior without explicit explanation. Deliberate interment implies recognition that death required response. It suggests that the dead were not abandoned where they fell. Whether that response reflects spiritual belief, social memory, emotional attachment, or pragmatic strategy cannot be separated cleanly at this temporal distance. The archaeological record preserves conduct, not interior thought. What Tinshemet challenges is not the age of humanity, but the timeline of human interiority. If individuals were treated with care in death at this depth in time, then symbolic awareness may extend further back than once assumed, possibly shared across populations we previously divided too sharply along cognitive lines. The cave contains no monumental architecture. It preserves no carved figurines or decorated walls. Its evidence is quieter: a pit, a posture, pigment, stones placed with intention. Whether we designate the act as ritual or not, someone chose to respond to death with deliberate structure. That choice presses against long-standing boundaries about when symbolic behavior began to take form. The evidence records what was done. It does not record why, and sometimes the traces left behind are far more unsettling than a carefully placed body. Early Neolithic farmers of the linear pottery culture spread across Central Europe in the 6th millennium BCE, building timber longhouses, cultivating wheat and barley, and shaping decorated ceramics that appear across vast territories. Their settlements suggest expansion and agricultural stability rather than collapse. Fields were cleared, livestock managed, and villages established with recognizable architectural order. Within this world of patterned growth, enclosure systems were sometimes constructed, ditches and palisades marking space in ways that seemed deliberate rather than defensive. At Herxheim, in what is now southwest Germany, one such enclosure was excavated. The site belongs to the later phase of the linear pottery culture, roughly between 5300 and 4950 BCE. Concentric ditches encircled the settlement. What filled sections of those ditches was not ordinary refuse. Archaeologists uncovered the heavily broken remains of hundreds of individuals, perhaps more than 1,000. These were not articulated skeletons laid carefully in graves. Bones were dispersed, mixed and shattered. Long bones had been split open, skulls were fractured, some intentionally opened. Cut marks appear on many elements, consistent with the removal of flesh. Certain breakage patterns resemble those observed when animal carcasses are processed for marrow. The parallels are difficult to dismiss. The material was deposited in patterned ways. Human remains were intermingled with selected pottery fragments, some originating from distant linear pottery regions hundreds of kilometers away. These ceramics were intentionally broken before placement in the ditches. The deposits combine bone and artifact in arrangements that imply coordination rather than random discard. At first glance, the evidence appears stark. Cut marks, marrow extraction, large numbers of individuals. These features are frequently cited in discussions of cannibalism. Some researchers argue that Herxheim represents episodes of systematic human consumption, possibly embedded in ritual practice during the final phases of the linear pottery culture. The case rests on the correspondence between human bone processing and known butchery patterns. Yet the cut marks are visible, the motive is not. Fragmentation alone does not prove consumption. In some mortuary traditions, bodies are exposed, disarticulated, or transformed before final deposition. Breaking bones may serve symbolic or ritual purposes unrelated to nutrition. The presence of pottery from distant regions suggests that people, and perhaps the dead themselves, were brought to Herxheim from far beyond the local settlement. The enclosure may have functioned as a gathering place whose activities do not fit easily into categories of warfare or famine. The broader linear pottery cultural record does not display uniform destruction or sudden regional abandonment tied directly to this site. If violence occurred, it did not produce immediate societal collapse. The context resists reduction to a simple massacre narrative. Interpretation depends on how we read resemblance. When human bones bear marks similar to those left on animals, it is tempting to apply the same explanation. But similarity of pattern does not guarantee identity of intent. The evidence confirms cutting, breaking, and placement. Whether flesh was consumed as sustenance, incorporated into ritual acts, or removed as part of mortuary transformation remains debated. What distinguishes Herxheim is scale combined with repetition. The deposits were not singular events. The process occurred multiple times within a constructed enclosure, embedded in a culture otherwise known for ordered settlements and recognizable material traditions. The contrast between agricultural stability and the treatment of the dead complicates any simple portrait of early farming communities. Herxheim confronts us with traces that resemble violence but refuse a single explanation. It is neither an unambiguous battlefield nor a conventional cemetery. It is a place where bodies were altered and arranged within defined boundaries, leaving physical marks that invite dramatic conclusions while still allowing alternative readings. When physical evidence carries the appearance of violence, interpretation can solidify around the most forceful explanation, even when the material itself permits more than one. The bones record what was done. They do not settle what it meant. In some landscapes, it is excess that distorts the story. In others, it is absence. A low ridge rises above the western coast of the Peloponnese, overlooking the Ionian Sea. For centuries, nothing on its surface suggested that it held the remains of a major sanctuary. The terrain is uneven but unremarkable: scrub, soil, scattered stone. Wind moves across the hill from the sea below. No standing columns mark the place. No monumental facade announced its past. Ancient authors, however, spoke of a sanctuary in this region. The geographer Strabo, writing in the early Roman period, described a revered temple of Poseidon near Samikon, a site associated with the cities of Tryphilia. His reference endured in the literary tradition. The physical structure it described did not. Scholars searched for it for more than a century. The Western Peloponnese contains multiple ancient sites, shifting coastlines, and layers of occupation. Identifying a sanctuary mentioned in a classical text requires more than matching a name on a map. It requires ground alignment and architecture. For decades, Samikon remained a point on paper rather than a structure in stone. The text survived, the building did not. Excavations at Samikon in the early 21st century began to change that silence. Beneath accumulated soil and later disturbances, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of a substantial temple. The plan emerged gradually, approximately 28 meters in length and just over 9 meters in width. The scale exceeded earlier expectations for the site. This was not a modest rural shrine. The building dates primarily to the 6th century BCE, in the Archaic period. Its ground plan includes a vestibule and 2 main interior spaces separated by central supports, an arrangement less common than the simple cellar layouts familiar from many Greek temples. Fragments of an archaic marble periranterion, a basin used for ritual purification, were found within the structure. A bronze plaque bearing traces of inscription was recovered, though its full reading remains under study. The architectural footprint corresponds to the kind of sanctuary one would expect in a region described as housing a prominent cult. The identification with the Temple of Poseidon is not based on wishful thinking alone. The location aligns with the coastal setting described in ancient sources. The scale matches the significance implied by literary accounts. The discovery of a formal sacred precinct wall further supports the interpretation of the site as a major sanctuary rather than an isolated building. While no inscription explicitly names Poseidon within the excavated remains, the convergence of geography, architecture, and textual reference narrows the possibilities. What distinguishes Samikon in this sequence of cases is not ambiguity of interpretation, but the long persistence of doubt. The lack of visible remains led some to question whether the sanctuary described in the texts had been exaggerated, misplaced, or misunderstood. Without standing columns or obvious ruins, legend and geography blurred. The rediscovery does not dramatize the past, it restores proportion to it. A literary reference once treated cautiously now stands on a material foundation. The ridge above the Ionian Sea was not empty, it had simply been quiet. The recovery of the temple does not resolve every question. The precise nature of rituals performed there, the political role of the sanctuary within Tryphilian networks, and the reasons for its eventual decline remain subjects of ongoing research. Yet, the central uncertainty that persisted for generations, whether the sanctuary existed at all, has shifted. When nothing stands, imagination fills the ridge. When foundations return to light, the story grows quieter. Across centuries, stone survives, interpretation does not. What changes is not always the past itself, but the way we arrange its fragments. And sometimes the quiet correction matters more than the dramatic discovery. If one of these stories stayed with you, let it travel. Like the video. Subscribe if you haven't. The search continues here on Riddle Me This Mysteries.